Good evening, everybody. My name is Ware Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our staff and our partners at Island Press, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our presentation of Howard Frumkin with Joseph Winters, part of our Arno G. Mitulski Science Lecture Series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We're very glad you've joined us for tonight's virtual event, which will run around 60 minutes, including Q&A. To submit your questions, please enter meet.ps/Frumkin or scan the QR code right now on your screen with your smartphone. You can ask questions at any time, and we'll drop this link in the chat too to remind you where to go once we get to the actual Q&A. We can't guarantee we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new events and podcasts truly every day. Upcoming events include Mark Elbrock and Chris Morgan, host of KOW's terrific podcast, The Wild, discussing coexistence between humans and mountain lions. Volcanologist Robin George Andrews on what eruptions can tell us about the history of our planet. Photographer Art Wolf's extraordinary images of the night sky, and Ashley Jean Yeager with Dr. Anand Tirumalai on the life of astronomer Vera Rubin. Those are all just science events. There's so much more on our website. So check it out and join our email list to get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Mitulski Science Lecture Series is supported by Microsoft in particular, but as you must know by now, Town Hall is more than anything a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members joining us tonight. If you're not yet a member and you also share their belief that our community is energized and empowered through questions of politics, science, and culture, please, we hope you'll consider joining as well. You'll find membership information on our website. Could expect that probably. Finally, you'll certainly want to learn more about tonight's topics, and the best way is to purchase a copy of Howard's book. Please use the link in the chat to get your own copy through Island Press. And with all of that, Howard Frumkin is the Senior Vice President for the Trust for Public Lands, setting up an institute there to advance the organization's 4 major strategic goals: health, equity, climate action, and community. You might also know him from a previous life as Professor Emeritus of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences at the University of Washington School of Public Health right here in Seattle, where he was Dean from 2000 to 2006. He's previously Director of the National Center for Environmental Health at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Frumkin is the author or co-author of well over 300 scientific journal articles and chapters, and his 9 books include Making Healthy Places, also from Island Press back in 2011, 2016's Environmental Health from Global to Local, and 2 titles exploring the notion of planetary health, one from Cambridge University Press and subtitled Safeguarding Human Health and the Environment in the Anthropocene. The other, well, I'm getting ahead of myself just in a moment. Joseph Winters is an early career journalist covering climate as Grist's News and Politics Fellow. Recent graduate of Harvard, Joseph served as a senior U.S. editor for the Harvard Political Review and worked as an organizer for Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard. He's previously interned at the public radio international show Living on Earth and at NPR's Oregon Public Broadcasting. Howard Frumkin's new book, co-written with Samuel Myers, is called Planetary Health: Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves, and it's the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Winters and Howard Frumkin.
Ware, thank you very much. This is Howie, and I'll start us off just to say what a pleasure and honor it is to be here at Town Hall and to emphasize to all the listeners one of the most important things Ware said, which is if you're not a member, do what I did and become a member. This is a jewel in Seattle's cultural life. We're going to start off the presentation with a video that in about 10 minutes, 9 or 10 minutes, captures a lot of the spirit of planetary health, and I think will provide us with a good foundation for the conversation that Joseph and I will have. So, Josh, if we can roll them.
I want to tell you a story. Once there was a breathtakingly beautiful planet with swirling patterns of blue and green and white moving through vast, dark space, a perfect distance from its warming sun to develop an explosion of millions of forms of wild, improbable, interconnected, and unimaginably beautiful life. Late in the pulse of declining and emerging species, a newcomer arrived, neither particularly fast nor fierce, but with an unusually large and complex brain, and began to separate itself from the others. Like all life forms, early humans began to mobilize resources to support their needs. Our ingenuity in doing this exceeded any species the planet had ever known. Mastering tools, harnessing fire, developing agriculture, and domesticating animals, we began to appropriate the rest of nature to meet our needs. Somewhere along the way, we began to tell ourselves a story of human exceptionalism, that we are separate from nature and that the rest of the natural world is ours for the taking. Individuals and entire cultures with stories and ways of life that emphasized living in harmony with nature and protecting the web of life tended to be marginalized or destroyed. Late in the story, we discovered the nearly boundless energy stored in the fossil remains of previous life forms. Burning these fuels exponentially increased our ability to transform landscapes, develop new products and technologies, mine minerals from deep in the ground and sea, fell forests, expand agriculture and food production, transport people and products, and extend fishing to the remotest reaches of the ocean. In the space of less than a century, we became the dominant force shaping Earth's biophysical conditions. Our inventions and discoveries allowed most of humanity to experience breathtaking improvements in education, wealth, and health. Global adult literacy doubled from 1940 to 2015. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty fell from 62% to 10%, despite a nearly threefold increase in the global human population during that time. Average global life expectancy rose from 46 years to 72 years. But the same extraordinary technological and scientific developments that fueled these unimaginable improvements in human development over the course of a single lifetime also accelerated the erosion of our planet's natural systems. In removing ourselves from nature, we've allowed our collective activities to become extreme. To feed ourselves each year, we claim 40% of the world's land surface for croplands and pastures. We appropriate half the accessible fresh water, mostly to irrigate our crops. We've dammed over 60% of the world's rivers and cut down half the temperate and tropical forests. The pollution from our enterprises contaminates air, water, and soil at a global scale and is driving accelerating climate change. Of the total mass of mammals on Earth today, 36% is human beings, 60% is domesticated livestock, 4% is wild mammals. 2/3 of the birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and mammals that used to share the planet with us are gone. 1 million species face extinction, many within decades. In pursuit of our ambitions, all of nature has become collateral damage. But human beings are not disconnected from the rest of the natural world. Planetary Health is a rapidly growing transdisciplinary field focused on understanding and addressing the human health impacts of our degradation of natural systems. Planetary health research is teaching us that our dismantling of nature has become an urgent threat to human health and well-being. A rapidly changing climate, loss of biodiversity, pollution of air, water, and soil, deforestation and other land use changes, and scarcity of fresh water and arable land are interacting to affect the foundations of human well-being. The quality and quantity of food we can produce, the quality of air we breathe and water we drink, our exposure to infectious diseases and extreme weather events, even the habitability of the places many of us live. Every dimension of human health is being affected, from nutrition to infectious disease exposure, from non-communicable diseases to mental health. The enormous health gains we've achieved over the last several decades are now threatened by our own transformation of nature's systems. Nor are the health burdens distributed evenly or fairly. When warming causes malaria to move up into the East African highlands, the poorest families who cannot purchase bed nets are most vulnerable. When pollinating insects decline and crop yields fall, the wealthy can afford to purchase fresh fruit and vegetables while the poor suffer higher rates of heart disease, stroke, and certain cancers because of decreased consumption of these foods. When extreme weather and crop failures drive people from their homes, the wealthy are insulated while the poor suffer. Consumption patterns and value systems of the wealthiest people on Earth are putting the poorest people and future generations in harm's way. Awareness around planetary health is moving quickly across the world. From policymakers to the private sector to the general public, we're waking up to what Martin Luther King once described as the fierce urgency of now. To safeguard human health and well-being and to protect the rest of life on Earth will require deep, urgent, structural change in how we live and a global commitment to reversing our degradation of Earth's natural systems. Our growing awakening to this fact holds enormous promise. Looking out across the domains of global food systems, energy systems, manufacturing and the circular economy, urban design and green chemistry, we see a rich landscape of solutions. We can imagine a world 100 years from now where the human population has stabilized as a result of educating girls, creating economic opportunities for women, and providing access to contraception for couples who want it. A world in which we have extended today's remarkable gains in renewable energy technology and moved to a post-combustion energy system. A world where we are producing food and manufactured goods with dramatically reduced ecological inputs. And a world where most of us are living in cities that have been designed to optimize physical, mental, and cultural health while allowing nature to regenerate. The moment we face calls for more than rapid innovation in our technologies and practices. Underneath the ecological crisis we have created and the global health crisis that it is precipitating is a spiritual crisis. We've allowed our myth of human exceptionalism to create a rupture between humanity and the natural world we depend on. The reverence and awe that most of us feel toward nature has lost its authority in guiding our decisions. We will need to weave a new fabric with threads from indigenous knowledge, the world's faith traditions, literature, and the arts that reasserts our spiritual connection to the natural world. Our story of human exceptionalism, of extraction, domination, scarcity, and ultimately extinction will need to give way to new stories and values of interdependence, equity, abundance, regeneration, and renaissance. We find ourselves actors in one of history's greatest dramas. A lone species with an outsized talent for bending the natural world toward our will, spinning through space on a stunning but fragile planet. The same complex brain that has subjugated much of nature is bringing us news that the state of natural systems and the well-being of humanity cannot remain disconnected. We know that people around the world are suffering across every region and every dimension of health. We have the science, stories, and solutions in front of us. We know what to do. Will we do it?
That video, Howard, it covers the whole arc of human progress, from the beginnings of civilization to the progress that we've made to some of the errors that we have encountered along the way. Obviously, a very good overview of the field of planetary health. And this is all stuff that you cover in your book, co-authored with Sam Myers, or co-edited as well. And so I'm wondering, people have been talking about this intersection between the environment and health for a long time now. It's something that I studied in college and that other people have been working on. So what's new in your book? What new stuff do you bring to the conversation?
Joseph, I think you're right. Environmental health has been a field within public health for many years. When I got into it about 30, 40 years ago, it was mostly a field that concerned itself with toxic exposures, with asbestos and lead and solvents and pesticides, really important issues to tackle. But pulling together as many strands as we're pulling together now in planetary health, I think creates a new scientific paradigm. It's a different way of doing science and of thinking about the world than we've done before. I'm going to, from time to time tonight, if I may, show a couple of pictures, and I'll show one now just to illustrate this. So this is my cartoonish version of what makes planetary health different as a scientific paradigm. Each element of this has been around for a while, but pulling them all together is different. It is a people-centered approach, and that's different than a lot of environmental sciences, ecology, earth sciences, which really are about physical systems, but don't put people at the center. It is systems-based, so it stands in opposition or as an alternative to the reductionism that characterizes a lot of science. It looks at upstream causes. So if I see a case of cardiovascular disease, I don't just think about the person's behavior and the person's dietary choices, but I think about the physical environment, the urban fabric in which the person lives, which either facilitates physical activity or not. I think about the food system and what food it delivers to the person, what choices the person has. So those upstream root causes of health and wellness are important to consider. Deeply committed to equity, as you heard my co-editor Sam mention in the video. It's very future-oriented. It holds the assumption that we shouldn't be making decisions just about the present, but any decision we make now, what buildings we build, what energy sources we harvest, what crops we grow, what trees we plant, needs to be measured against conditions in 50 years or 100 years, because that's the time frame, the so-called 7 generations thinking that's important. It's solutions driven. We face a lot of problems now, and we need to be not just about navel gazing, but about crafting solutions. And it inspires hope. And I think that came through toward the end of that video. All of what we need to do to tackle these planetary crises don't spell a story of deprivation and sacrifice. They spell a story of opportunity. And so inspiring that hope is an important part of planetary health. I don't know of any other scientific paradigm that combines all of these features to create a unified way of thinking about the world's problems.
Yeah, I think that, well, especially what you said about systems thinking is what really differentiates planetary health from other fields that I think tend to get very siloed. But this is about looking at everything holistically together and the ways that things interact. I think it's a very useful way of thinking about the world. One of the concepts that I wanted to talk about from the video is this idea of humans having a broken relationship with nature. You talk about it at the very beginning. Somewhere along the path, we began to develop these ideas about domination, sort of like a rift between humans and the rest of the natural world. Can you talk a little bit more about how that came about and how we can begin to rethink our place in nature?
Yeah, so I can't claim to be a historian or an anthropologist, but all of us are familiar with deep roots to this separation between humans and nature that go way back in history. The Old Testament, you don't get too many lines into the book of Genesis before you read that God gave humans dominion over the planet. Now, some people translate that original word as stewardship and not dominion. But importantly, it's been interpreted as dominion for centuries now. In Greek philosophy, in the Enlightenment, there was an increasing abstraction of humans from the natural world, so much so that we can even talk now about humans and nature as if they're two different things, when there are plenty of traditions that would not recognize that distinction. And the results of that distinction are a long history of exploitative use of nature to serve human ends without much regard to unintended consequences. Divert the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya rivers in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, as the USSR did just a few decades ago, because you want the water for agriculture to feed people. What happens? You dry up the Aral Sea, you create a desert where there used to be water, you trigger dust storms that aggravate heart disease and lung disease hundreds of miles away. Closer to home, channelize the Mississippi River with levees. You lose more and more of the Mississippi Delta, as we're doing now, causing impoverishment, displacement, mental distress among the communities that live on or near the Delta. Level forests in Brazil, as we saw depicted in the video, to produce farmland, to grow soy, to feed cattle, for people to eat. And you contribute to poverty and infectious disease locally, where the forests are taken down, and to cardiovascular disease and colon cancer among carnivores thousands of miles away. So all of these actions, which reflect a separation from nature, not being heedful of the impacts of our dominion over nature, can be directly traced through evidence-based lines to human suffering.
Right. It reminds me of a recent book from Elizabeth Kolbert. It's called Under a White Sky, and it's about the way that humans try to solve human-caused problems with greater separation from nature. So you try to control a human-caused problem by, technologizing yourself out of it, and then you drag yourself deeper into this cycle of separation and making the problem even worse, having adverse outcomes on other systems. Everything is connected is basically the point.
Yeah, and I've read that book too and recommend it to everybody. It's a terrific book. She manages to inject humor into what is a fairly grim set of circumstances. But it's actually true that given the fix we've gotten ourselves into, technology is going to have to be part of the solution. And so if there's a lesson from our several centuries of depredations, it's deploy the technology carefully, thoughtfully, mindfully, scrutinize the impacts of the technology with diligence, so that if you're causing unintended consequences, which are inevitable in complex systems, you'll pick them up early and you can make course corrections as you incrementally manage the system. That's going to have to be a part of how we proceed. It's much more complex thinking, and it's much more humility than has typically been part of human activity.
Right. So when you talk about the idea of developing a new relationship with nature, having new stories to guide our way into the future, it's obviously a very big project. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on bridging that divide between, these conceptual ideas, and then, okay, you have to go to some politician and say, like, we need to rethink our humanity's narrative. Like, obviously you're not going to say that. So how do you go from these ideas to what needs to happen from small steps toward progress?
Well, I think these ideas need to be normalized. And I think we're seeing that happen with the UN Development Program, for example, has declared that planetary health is at the center of its work globally. University departments around the world are launching planetary health courses and degree programs. So I think we're seeing the field catch on. But much more important than the field called planetary health is the set of mental habits and attitudes that underlie it. It doesn't matter if nobody calls it planetary health. And so what you could say to policymakers is put human health and well-being and equity at the center of decision-making. Don't mortgage the future for the present. Think in systems. Measure what matters, such as human happiness, health and well-being, and environmental sustainability, and abandon indicators that don't measure what matters, such as the GDP. Those are specific actions, ways of thinking that can be brought to policymakers and decision makers, and to help move us along this path toward a healthy planet, healthy people on a healthy planet.
Mm. Speaking of policymakers, so you mentioned that this planetary health way of thinking is catching on in the health field and potentially with other experts. But I'm wondering if you've seen it, are enough political decision makers using this kind of thinking? For example, like at COP26, which we just saw, did you see planetary health framing, or was it lacking from many of the discussions?
Well, COP26, now there is a topic. I have to say COP26 featured more discussion of human health and human impacts than any previous conference of the parties has. So we're seeing the health dimension brought into the thinking much more. Now, none of us would claim that that was enough to make a material difference in the outcome at COP. It was a disappointing set of outcomes, but I think we're seeing a shift such that the implications of climate change for human well-being and the implications of lagging and tackling climate change for enormous suffering worldwide are becoming front and center. And so that in turn has to lead to changes in the way we invest money, the changes in the way we manage ecosystems and so on. And I do think we're seeing some changes on the part of investors. We saw some of the major investment houses announce that they're going to be getting out of fossil fuel development as one example. So those things follow naturally from the kind of thinking that Planetary Health invites us to undertake.
Mm. To what extent do you think that that raised awareness is a byproduct of the rise of the climate justice movement and that sort of framework within environmental advocacy?
Well, I think there are two linked movements that are hugely important. There's the climate justice movement, which has equity at its center, and there is the youth climate movement, which of course focuses on equity, but really I think that the bywords of the youth movement, Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, are all about a sustainable future. And of course, the primary focus on climate, the primary focus on equity are very mutually reinforcing. And I think that is hugely influential. I think many of the pieces of policy progress that we've seen in recent years have been directly due to that activism. I just learned in the introduction, Joseph, that you were part of the divest movement at Harvard. That, as you know, and you should feel very proud of that, that was a very, very difficult fight to win. And you won. So this is, and Harvard's not the only university that's divested from fossil fuels. It's a very positive step. So that sort of activism is key. And as the younger generation rises and takes on decision-making positions of authority, it's going to be all for the good. I think we'll see the cultural and political shift that we need accelerating.
What about in your own work? When you started doing work around the intersection between environment and health, I assume that the conversation around environmental justice was different than it is now. I'm wondering how your own thinking about planetary health has evolved with that shift toward greater focus on equity and environmental justice.
Well, you're right. When I got into this field, the environmental justice movement was just blossoming. And much of it is traced to a particular African-American county in North Carolina where there was a plan to install a hazardous waste site with polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. The community rose in opposition to that hazardous waste site, and a lot of the EJ work that we've seen in recent decades flowed from that. There was political leadership and thought leadership. But environmental justice means so much more than reducing disproportionate exposure to toxins. It also means providing equitable access to environmental goods, anything from parkland to green space to transportation to decent housing. It also means raising the spatial scale of environmental impacts on human health in our minds, from the molecular scale of PCBs getting into a person's body to the larger spatial scale of how cities are laid out to the entire planetary scale. So I think the EJ framework, equities-based, rights-based thinking has blossomed in the environmental movement, and that's all for the good. It's helped us understand that you can't tackle the climate crisis without tackling the crisis of equity, because the two are completely interlinked.
How do you think that those, or rather, let me put it this way. In the video, there's this great graphic that shows, it's like a funnel, and it shows all the factors that go toward creating these planetary health problems. And one of the mediating factors are things like culture, economic policies, other kind of politics. Can you, expand a little bit on the ways that these demographic inequalities arise surrounding environmental health?
Yeah. So you don't have to look too far. I mean, let's take a look at New Orleans after Katrina, which was now going on a generation ago. But there were vast disparities in the New Orleans population between those who were relatively well off and those who were less well off. And that partially overlaid who was white and who was non-white. That had to do with where people lived. There were more vulnerable parts of the city that tended to flood faster, like the lower Ninth Ward, largely Black, and the better parts of the city were at higher elevation. So that exemplifies that part of environmental justice is exposure. People are more exposed to hazards if they're in EJ communities. A second part of it is vulnerability. Once you're exposed, you're either quite vulnerable or less vulnerable. And that has to do with factors like your underlying health status, your ability to flee an area when you need to flee ahead of a hurricane. So, and those factors are disproportionately distributed as well. And a third factor is resilience. It's the ability of a community to bounce back after sustaining trauma. So if you have access to bank loans, and if you have access to social networks, then you can build back much more easily than if you don't. So those pathways of exposure and vulnerability and resilience all impact the different experiences the different communities have after climate disasters, but also after many of the impacts that climate change has, even the ones that aren't so acutely catastrophic.
What about, you live in Seattle? I'm wondering if you've seen any of these dynamics play out in your own community.
Well, yeah. Seattle, a little less than a number of other cities, but Seattle's not exempt. One of the dynamics that's interesting and that we've come to understand better in the last few years is the link between historic redlining and impacts of heat waves. And I bring that up now because we just had an unprecedented heat wave this past summer. So redlining, for those who don't know, was the practice back in the 30s of mortgage financiers, mortgage lenders, with the help of the federal home loan, with the federal agency, I think Federal Home Loan Administration, I think it was called. They designated certain neighborhoods as undesirable. These were minority neighborhoods, and mortgages weren't extended to families living in those neighborhoods. So it precluded those families from accessing the major mechanism in our country of accumulating wealth, and that is home ownership. So those neighborhoods became poor neighborhoods and remained poor neighborhoods over many generations. So from the 1930s up to now, almost a century later, those neighborhoods can still be revealed through mapping to be the poorest neighborhoods in cities, the least healthy neighborhoods, and interestingly, the hottest neighborhoods when the heat waves occur, because they have less vegetation, more dark surfaces, more of the factors that make urban neighborhoods hot, the so-called urban heat islands. So here you've got a disparity within a city such that you can have, we well know, differences in life expectancy of 10 or 12 years in parts of a city just a few miles apart, differences in the temperature that people sustain during a heat wave, all of these superimposed on the differentials in wealth and poverty that we have in the country.
Right. It's a great example of the way that all these systems interact to disproportionately harm people who are already marginalized. Chris has a great explainer about the urban heat island effect and redlining. Specifically, the case study that they use is for Portland, which has it was one of the worst places for redlining in the country, and also was subject to that heat wave. I just want to take a sec to remind viewers that you can submit questions for Howard using the tool. I think you guys might have a QR code or a way to submit questions. So keep those coming. We've already got a few, and we'll pivot to those in a bit. I want to ask Howard, though, first, I want to talk a little bit about COVID. So in your book, you have this whole section at the end drawing connections between the pandemic, and also the environmental and climate crises. So how is COVID-19 also a planetary health crisis?
Well, let's be clear. Climate change is a risk factor for lots of infectious diseases, from malaria to dengue, from salmonella to Lyme disease. But climate change didn't cause COVID. On the other hand, there are factors that propelled the pandemic, and they are factors that relate to changes in our planet. So habitat destruction that brings humans into closer contact with wildlife and with disease reservoirs, dysfunctional food systems, including the wet markets that were potentially a source of infection, globalization, the rapid transmission of not only people and goods, but viruses, weak public health systems. So all of these global features, weak public health systems, by the way, being a predictable outcome of economic arrangements that underfund public goods in overprivileged private gain. With those planetary trends happening, it's a perfect setup for a pandemic like COVID, and it will be the perfect setup for the next pandemic as well. This aligns with the core idea of planetary health, that you can't have healthy people without a healthy planet.
Right. It also reminds me of one of the other points in your book where you talk about surprises, and the way that all of these systems are interlinked can often have, how do you put it in the book, a cascade of effects across other physical and biological systems with consequences that are hard to predict. So when you affect one system, it can have this chain reaction and it's hard to know how that's going to play out. Do you think that is fair to categorize COVID as belonging to that sort of phenomenon where, one system affects another and then it has all these adverse consequences down the line?
Well, it's really shown that. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call COVID a surprise, because people were predicting for a long time that this would happen, and shame on us as a country and as a world for not having heeded those warnings and prepared. But isn't it interesting how other system elements have changed during the course of the pandemic? So who would have thought that a pandemic would lead to radical changes in the value of urban commercial real estate because people are getting used to not going into the office? Who would have thought that a pandemic would lead to a renewed appreciation for life on the streets and for parks, because people crave being outside and being with each other in relatively safe circumstances? Those things in turn may lead to permanent changes in some cities in the allocation of street space to human use and in the budgeting for parks. There may be some negative consequences. Who would have thought that a pandemic would drive urban sprawl? But as some people want to move outside the city, no longer needing to be near where they work, we may see a pressure on exurban land and the development of more housing there. So complex systems do generate surprises. That's what they do. And that's why the management of complex systems involves iterative management, constantly collecting observations on the things that matter: land use, nutrition, employment, happiness, health, and making adjustments as you can so that the system optimizes as many of the things we care about as possible.
I also want to ask about hope. In the video and in your book, you make a great effort to stress that you don't want the climate conversation to be all doom and gloom, and that there are things to be hopeful for. So what makes you hopeful? Why do you think we should have hope?
Well, let me just make a general plug for hope, and then I'll tell you what makes me hopeful. I'm bullish on hope, and I'm bullish on hope for three main reasons. First, as a physician, as a member of a healing profession, my calling has to do with keeping people healthy and happy and avoiding suffering. Well, it turns out that hopeful people feel better than hopeless people. Hopeful people have lower rates of heart disease and lung disease and cancer. They do better when they get sick. They are more resilient to personal trauma. Hopeless people have higher risks for many of those diseases. Young people who don't have hope are more likely to engage in destructive behaviors, unprotected sex and violence and so on. So hope is good for people, and that's one reason to propel hope. Secondly, hopeful people do things. Hopeful people take action to achieve their goals. Excuse me. Hopeless people withdraw. This is a moment in history when we need to be active. We need to be about solving existential problems. So I'm all for hope because hope drives constructive action. And third, being an evidence-based kind of a guy, I'm all for hope because there's a lot of empirical basis for hope. Now, there are some doomers out there who say we've lost the fight. The fight's over. Let's just hunker down and get ready for human extinction. The evidence doesn't support that point of view at all. Trends are grim. There's no denying or minimizing that. But there are many, many reasons to feel hopeful. Technology is advancing. Batteries are better and better and cheaper and cheaper. Photovoltaic electricity is better and better and cheaper and cheaper. In fact, renewable electricity is cheaper than fossil electricity in most places in the world right now. The youthful activism that we talked about before is blossoming. There are great initiatives in the private sector across many, many industries, from motor vehicles to textiles, even to aviation and to cement manufacturing, steel manufacturing, some of the hardest to decarbonize sectors, but we're seeing major advances in those sectors. So on and on, where political jurisdictions are stepping up. And even if in our country there's been paralysis at the federal level and we're not seeing the action that we'd like, at the state level and mostly at the urban level, at the city level, we're seeing tremendous leadership and progress. So there's every reason in the world to feel hopeful. The two things that make me most hopeful, I'd have to say activism by young people and technological advances. I think those are the two things that'll save us.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll move on to some questions from the audience. But you talk about activism as one of the sources of hope, and that makes me wonder, how do you balance this hopeful vision for the future that's all about building things up, better medical systems, schools, political institutions, technology, with what a lot of activism is centered around, which is sort of the complement to that building up. Sometimes you need to tear things down in order to make space for all of the new, better things. So what do you think we need to dismantle in order to build the healthier, more just, more sustainable world that we need?
Well, let me start from the most abstract and then get a little more concrete. We need to dismantle some old ways of thinking. We need to dismantle the idea that we are separate from nature, as we talked about earlier. We need to dismantle the notion of dominion over the natural world and replace it with the idea of collaboration and coexistence with the natural world. One of the ways of doing that, I should mention, is by learning from traditional wisdom, much of which predates Western reductionism and exploitation of nature, and offers really nice, wise ways of living on the world. So there are some conceptual models we need to dismantle. I think we need to dismantle much of our current economic thinking. If we put profit making at the center of what we do, and if we allow that to grow uncontrolled and unregulated and untrammeled as we've done, if we allow power to concentrate in the hands of the wealthy few, that's inconsistent with equitable stewardship of the natural world. Then there are some more concrete things we need to dismantle, like the fossil fuel infrastructure, and we need to replace that with renewable energy. We need to dismantle much of our food system. The very heavy dependence that we and many other wealthy countries have on animal source protein isn't compatible with sustainable use of land and resources. So we need to move more toward plant-forward diets. We need, if not to dismantle, to renovate from the studs out lots of our building stock and make it a lot more energy efficient. We need to dismantle the automobile-dependent infrastructure that characterizes our transportation system and move toward active transportation, walking and cycling, and mass transit. Now, in balancing, to answer your question, finally, to balance destruction with construction. I think that's as much about messaging as it is about the actual work we have to do. I think we need to have a North Star, an attractive, appealing, inspiring vision of the world we want, and move toward that. There are lots of people whose status quo will be disrupted by the transition that we need. We're looking at probably the biggest and fastest transition in human history. It's very threatening to many people. So both protecting people whose livelihoods and stability are disrupted, but also presenting a positive vision that we can all aspire to, and presenting it in terms of solidarity and collegiality instead of descending into the culture wars that are all too prevalent. It's a really important part of the way we talk about where we're going.
Mm. And the good news about a lot of those changes that you mentioned is that they'll make us happier. Walking or biking instead of being, jammed in traffic, being healthier if we switch to more plant-based diets. So that at least seems like some good news for people.
Well, it's why I said earlier that this transition is a story of opportunity and possibility, not a story of deprivation and sacrifice. Ironically, we've had one of the interesting fields that we can learn from is the field of hedonic psychology, the study of happiness, which has blossomed in recent decades. And what we know about human happiness, and this is true in a cross-cultural sense, is that getting a lot of stuff has very little to do with making you happy. What the determinants of human happiness are time with friends, time with family, good solid relationships with friends and family, meaningful work, the opportunity to learn new things on an ongoing basis. People like that. Being around beauty and inspiration. The natural world is a big part of that. Health is a part of it. So these are all things that actually the decarbonization of our society and a shift toward more stewardship of the planet will promote. Backing off from the acquisitive society that we live in, it won't make us less happy. Now, a lot of us are persuaded that we need to buy a lot of stuff and consume a lot of stuff to be happy, but it turns out the evidence says that's probably not so. And so really one of the foundations of planetary health thinking is let's ground what we do in what we know is good for people, what makes people happy, and let's try to maximize those things.
That's actually a perfect segue to this first question from the audience. So they ask, you mentioned GDP and a need to measure value differently. Why is so much of dialogue about climate talked about through a lens of economics? What are other ways to measure value?
Well, why so much talk about climate is through the lens of economics, I think is because short-term levers of change are largely economic levers. We know, for example, that tax policy influences behavior rapidly and effectively. And so it makes sense that we're talking about economic levers to achieve rapid change. But some other ways in the medium to long term to measure progress would be indicators like the genuine progress indicator, the gross national happiness index. And there are about a dozen such indicators out there. They tend to measure equity, and they measure environmental sustainability. They measure the strength of social ties and human connectedness, sometimes with people's self-reports of how well networked they are, sometimes with behaviors such as voting and volunteering. And you can actually measure happiness by, believe it or not, surveying people, asking them if they're happy. All of the measures of happiness that we have turn out to be reflected quite well in just asking people how happy they are. People know the answer to that question. So indicators like the genuine progress indicator or the gross national happiness index are really good ways of measuring what matters, and much more fit for purpose than the GDP, which was never intended to be an overall measure of societal success.
We have another question. To what extent is planetary health as a field and systems thinking accessible to the general public? In other words, who gets to decide the environmental future of the planet? Sort of asking whether the academic nature of this conversation is accessible to, I guess, lay people.
I guess this has been an academic conversation, and I'm a little sorry about that because I think that these ideas are very accessible ideas for people of faith. If you read Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical from a few years back, it is the most beautiful and complete statement of planetary health principles that one could wish for. So I think faith communities are one forum in which these ideas very much have traction. It's true of a lot of the world's major faith traditions. I also think that um, everything from hiking clubs to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts to gardening clubs, I mean, these are all forms of social engagement in which planetary health principles may not go by that name, but they're very much alive and well.
Mm.
So part of what eggheads like me have to do is learn to share these ideas in plain language and to make them as appealing as I think they can be to as many people as possible. I also think that there's an opportunity to infuse planetary health thinking into K-12 education. We've taught science in many of the same ways since I was an elementary school student in the years right after the Civil War, and it really is time to change that. So part of the ways of socializing these ideas is to build them into our educational system.
Right, absolutely. And education can also be used to sort of bridge that divide between humans and nature and mend the gap. That is sort of related to another audience member's question. They ask, Aldo Leopold's The Land Ethic urged considering the land as an equal member of the community, a move that's arguably key to undermining human exceptionalism, aka arrogance. Do you consider his perspective, taught from the beginning of a human's life, to have a part in planetary health?
Yes, I do. It's a really interesting question. There are a couple of examples globally of a rights-based framework that has been enshrined in law. So a couple of constitutions now grant rights to nature, and there is legislation at the national level that grants rights to certain river systems around the world. Kind of hard to get your mind around what that would mean in legal practice. But the notion that we share the planet with other species and with non-living, inanimate natural systems is a really interesting notion to bring into the legal system, to a rights-based framework to test ourselves in terms of coexistence and respect and stewardship.
Mm. All right, this is a very specific question. Have you heard about the fine-grained sand that is being left behind by the melting glaciers and its potential uses to fight climate change? If you have, can you tell us more about it?
No, I don't know enough about it to say a single thing. Sorry.
Fair enough. Okay, I think this is maybe going to be our last question. We'll see. So how can those of us who agree with you make any difference when politicians and corporations who make important decisions don't listen to us or have our priorities?
It's a great question, and it's very akin to a question that I hear a lot, which is, what's the one most important thing I can do? Vote. Vote, 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 because we live in a democracy, and elected officials follow the public will. So the more we can enshrine these priorities into electoral politics, as we saw in the last presidential election, the more action will follow. I mean, if you doubt that, take a look at the difference between climate policies of the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and remind yourself that that change in federal policy on climate depended on the votes of a few tens of thousands of people in swing states. So the activism to get the vote out and encouraging candidates to run who care about the survival of the planet and getting those candidates elected, and then letting our elected officials know that this is important to us. Very important to work through the political process. It's how a lot of big decisions are made.
Right. Such an important perspective too, especially because I feel that there's a lot of despair and hopelessness that arise from this idea that people need to be personally responsible for reducing their emissions in every way possible. It's again that deprivation mindset that you were talking about earlier. And I think planetary health and its focus on systems thinking is a good way to sort of get around that and realize that, you know, your individual decisions matter, but there are larger forces at play that can be influenced.
Joseph, thank you for the great curating of our conversation tonight. It's been a pleasure to work with you.
Yeah, thank you so much
Thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm going to pass it back to Town Hall for conclusion. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
And I just want to say on behalf of Town Hall, a huge thank you to both of you for the conversation, and thank you to everyone in the audience for the questions and for joining us this evening. One more reminder to pick up a copy of the book. There is a link in the chat to purchase it directly through Island Press. And once again, thank you all and have a great night.